My name is Rich Schmidt. We're here with Aaron Kendall. It's June 3rd, 2024. We're at Compris Vineyard in Newberg. And Aaron, thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah.
First question, why wine?
It didn't start as wine years ago. Very little interest when I initially got into the industry. It was needed a change, I suppose, from previous career and life trajectory. And was in it, my first harvest was in New Zealand, 2008. And I showed up the first day, and they said, our press operator isn't going to make it. Do you want to be the press operator? And I said, what's a press? And 2 months after, I guess 6 weeks after that, after running, I think we had 2,200 tons through the facility. I was an expert with, 2 20-ton and 3 10-ton presses. So trial by fire, certainly. But I got hooked. It was the adrenaline that hooked me, the physical nature of the job that hooked me at first. And so for my first few harvests, that's in traveling, mostly what it was about.
So let's back up a little bit, talk about life before wine then a little bit. Tell us about where you're born and raised and kind of trajectory before wine.
Yeah, born and raised in Dundee, New York, in the Finger Lakes. My father was a contractor, had his own business. Mom was a social worker before she stayed home to raise my brother and I. And so we grew up in a wine region, but not necessarily in the industry, adjacent to it. My mom worked at a couple tasting rooms back there, so wine was always around, but I wouldn't categorize. My father wasn't necessarily a wine drinker at the time, and my mom was casual. Mm-hmm. So not a lot of exposure to it. As we got older and got into trouble, there's certainly wine that was borrowed or taken from other people's parents when we weren't able to purchase it ourselves. But that was it. And so started working with my dad when I was 12 or 13, kind of a gopher on job sites in the summer times, and carried that on through high school. Decided after high school, with a little bit of guidance, counselor mentorship, that I would go to college for teaching, secondary education. I was going to be a history teacher. And I went to college for 4 years in Brockport, New York, and that was a good 4 years. I can't say I was the best student. Solid C student for sure. But my social life that thrived.
A+.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it was in my junior year, New York State raised the bar for what it took to become a teacher, and in that same time, No Child Left Behind came in, and so the standards for students were lowered at the same time that the standards for teachers were raised. So I didn't make the grade to be into the teaching program. So I just decided I'd graduate with a history degree and figured out after that. And I didn't. I worked construction for 9 months after I got out of college, which was another incredible experience. Building docks on a lake. So me and 2 guys on a pile driver in the water for 6 hours a day, I loved it. I love swimming, so it was a dream job for me. After that, moved to Binghamton, New York, worked in construction sales. So went from sort of the hands-on side of it to the sales side of it. So building material wholesaler. And did that for 2.5 years and had a relationship end and decided that Binghamton wasn't where I wanted to be, and my brother just finished a harvest in Sonoma at Klein, and someone there told him that you can go to New Zealand and someone will pay you to work hard. And I said, well, I'll take that trip. That sounds like a good time, and that's leads us to the last story. So we showed up and asked what a great press was.
So you mentioned being kind of drawn in by the physical work, the adrenaline. It's a pretty common story we've heard. So I'm curious, as you're in the process of your first harvest, are you thinking this is something I want to do, I want to keep doing, or what is the kind of your reality as you're working through that first harvest?
It was It was tough because it was a juice processing plant, and it processed grapes into juice and then would ship off for, all the big players down there, Nobloki's and Mudhouse. So there wasn't much fermentation that happened on site. So it was just the process of it. And I just wanted to keep moving at that point. I just wanted to keep traveling. And that was still the goal. And again, my brother, who, he just left last week. He's also a winemaker, but back in the Finger Lakes. He, after he worked in New Zealand, because he worked in '08, got a job at Adelsheim. And a lot of how I stayed in wine was very sort of serendipitous. Things sort of just happened and worked out. And I said, yeah, I just sort of went with the flow for a time. And they had an intern drop out at Adelsheim in 2008. And Brother Nathan mentioned to Eric Kramer, hey, my brother's looking to work at Harvest. Would you like to interview him? And so I interviewed with Eric Kramer while I was still in New Zealand, and I said, yeah, come on board. So 2008, my first Oregon Harvest under Dave Page and Eric Kramer. I would consider them both to be mentors, and certainly pushed me in the direction to become more interested in wine and the process and not just the labor. And yeah, me and my brother packed up that summer, drove cross country, just the two of us. Showed up. I imagine it looked a little ridiculous, us falling out of a Volkswagen Passat, like end of August. But you couldn't ask for a better harvest. First harvest in Oregon. 2008 was, the Goldilocks of harvest. The weather was just right. The grapes were just right. And so it was an amazing crew that year at Adelsheim as well for interns. So we all really bonded. No dramas, as there often can be. And again, I think I'd earned a reputation as a worker, and so they asked me to come back the following year. And in the meantime, traveled back to New Zealand, traveled to Australia in 2009. Worked about 4 weeks, got a lot of tanks cleaned, a lot of presses cleaned, and then 2009, Australia had their big fires in the Yarra Valley. So I made it through Black Saturday. A bit harrowing, but that's another story. And they had to let us all go as interns just because they had too many of the vineyards burned up and too much of the fruit was compromised. So again, just threw out as many CVs as I could to New Zealand because our harvest hadn't started yet. And heard back from a small 8,000 case winery in Hawke's Bay, Clearview Estate, Taiwanga, and the winemaker just hadn't bothered to hire an intern yet, and he said, yeah, sure, you're hired. And that worked out. It was just myself and him, Barry Rewai, who's another person I would consider to be a mentor, and someone else who sort of brought me in and allowed me to become a part of the process and not just the help, not just the worker. So yeah, I was there for 6 months, 7 months that time. They kept me on through the harvest and then an extended period after that. And then again, back to Adelsheim in 2009 for another hot but good harvest. And, I sort of got a good rapport with the people that I had worked with. So Adelsheim brought me back, and then Clearview brought me back again the following year. And their big varietals, they're big, almost 50% Chardonnay, much warmer than we have here in Hawke's Bay, much Mediterranean. And then a lot of Bordeaux varietals and Syrah. A little bit of Pinot, but Barry and I he would joke that Pinot wasn't a real red wine, but I would argue otherwise. I'm not sure if he still has that opinion, but a little back and forth banter there.
Tell me about the process of sort of, you mentioned kind of being treated more as a partner rather than the kind of the help. Tell me about the process of learning the work and of learning the method or the reason behind the work. How fast did you feel like you were kind of understanding the whole process of making wine?
I think it helped having grown up in construction and having learned how to work. I think people are workers, and I think working well is a learned is something you learn, and working efficiently. So that all came very natural to me. So I think that I was able to focus more on the whys, the process of the whys, and what was going on, and have time with Dave and Eric Kramer and Barry to have some of these like more scientific things explained. I didn't have chemistry as an interest of mine, but I don't have a background in it. It's a history major because I wasn't any good at math. So yeah, again, just having things explained to me, having all three of those guys take the time and explain to me why we're doing it, what we're doing, instead of just like, here's what I want to have done and then go do it, kind of thing. And especially with Barry, it was just the two of us, so we had a lot of time and a lot of late nights just together, and he would just explain to me why they did it, what he was looking for, some of the chemical processes, some of the fermentation, kinetics, just all the details, and those, and then paying a little better attention because of that, and trying to see the process through, and being at a place for 6 months, 7 months, being able to see the wine through much of that process, fermentation and the beginning of barrel aging, and also going back to the same place 2 or 3 years in a row. You can see your work from the year before carried over, and because harvest is such a small snapshot, and in some places you have the winemaker has the bandwidth to teach you. Other places it's just we have to get the work done. All right, I'll explain it later, and then you're gone. So you can and can't learn a lot. There's a lot of opportunity there, but there's also a chance for a lot of missed opportunity.
So you mentioned kind of coming back to the same place, so you're kind of bouncing between hemispheres, but staying in the same places year to year. Tell me about, again, are you starting to think this is something you want to keep doing, or do you have a goal in mind at this point of like a long-term career?
I think it was 2010 that really started to solidify, and that was another Adelsheim Clearview year, and I really started to think, I kind of want to see this process through. I want to, go to school. I want to become a winemaker. I want to learn how this all works. Really dive into it. And again, it was those three that kept that going. And I enjoyed learning and growing and continuing in that. And they all allowed me to do that. They also the challenge of just the harvest. Like that's, so I had that physical thing was sort of satiated, and then it started to become more of a cerebral, more of a mental exercise in how and the why.
So what did you do next?
I took a harvest off in 2011, went and took some chemistry courses with the idea to go enroll at the Montpellier Super Agro program in France. I had a couple friends, intern friends, who had gone through the program, and that ended up falling through because I didn't have economics in my coursework, and then ran out of time to do anything with economics. But in the meantime, helped out a friend with his masonry business. I worked masonry for almost a year with him, which is probably some of the harder work I've done. That stuff it physically sort of grinds you down. But I loved it. And anyway, long story short, when we were doing some work, and it was April, and I remember right where I was, we were building a wheelchair ramp for a church, and I was digging a hole in frozen mud in April in upstate New York, and my phone rang, and it's Dave Page. Like, hey, what do you want? He's like, do you want a full-time job? I said, yeah. When do you need me? He says, we'll take you now if you're ready. But I'd committed to my friend who's just started out his business. I'm like, can I be there for harvest and late August? He's like, yeah, that works. I'll see you then. Like classic Dave Page fashion, just like click. I'm like, all right, I'm gonna have to follow up with this just to make sure it's a done deal. So yeah, let my friend know, and same thing, very similar to 2008. Packed everything I had into a Ford Escape and drove cross country.
At least the car had changed.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I couldn't say it was any cleaner, but yeah. So I started full-time in 2011.
And what was the initial job?
Cellar hand was the initial job, and by, I think it was a month and a half later, they promoted me to cellar master. And in that time, met my wife, Tracy, who you've met too. She was an intern there, and I was still at that time a cellar hand. So we met harvest 2011, which was a very late harvest. So we had a lot of time to get to know each other while cleaning the winery over and over again in preparation for the grapes.
Waiting for the rain to stop.
Yeah, that finally showed up in October, mid-October. And that was an interesting year. It wasn't like anything I'd seen before. You know, going from 8, 9, and 10 wasn't too dissimilar, but it was more of a normal harvest, and it was wetter. And then to 11, which is, you know, one of the cooler ones we've had, or had up to that point. So seeing sort of the range of what Oregon had, and that piqued my interest. Some, you know, just being more in tune with the weather, with like nature, growing seasons, grapes, what the wine. Again, spending year to year to year, you get to see what 8 tastes like, what 9 tastes like, what 10 tastes like, eventually what 11 tastes like. So, and then starting to think about that in sort of the bigger picture of like the vineyards and the process and the decisions that are made during those times, and then like filtration, bottling, any additions or tweaks that are made later on, élevage. So yeah, the full-time, I had an idea what full-time entailed, but being able to see the process through for a full year, and I always knew that there was more that went into it than just harvest. That's the big decisions are made there, but you know, they're certainly the final decisions in some cases.
I'm curious about the slow times. Obviously, when you're going from harvest to harvest, you're, like you say, you're kind of seeing the rush over and over again. Mm-hmm. Tell me about the first sort of post-harvest when you're still full time. You're starting to get to know your job, but there's not that kind of the adrenaline rush. What was it like the first like full year where you were at Adelsheim?
Yeah, I mean, it was still. I hadn't lived permanently anywhere for 4 years at that point, so it was all getting to know Oregon and getting to know Tracy. It was all still very new, so it was all caught up in the rush of that as well. So it wasn't. It was slow, but it was still new enough to me. A lot of the things, so I was just sort of taking in, absorbing as much as I could with Dave and Gina, who's over there too, and just all the little pieces that make a final wine, and volunteering for as much as I could, and going out and tasting on the weekends, and all the things that I'm not any good at anymore, but should be better about. But yeah, just being as involved as I could, just filling that time.
What were your initial impressions of Oregon as you're now kind of a resident of Oregon and of the wine industry here?
It was incredibly welcoming. I think my first year, I can't remember who the folks were, but they had a bed and breakfast in Lafayette, and they had this big intern party. So all the interns came, and it was, you know, people from all over the world, and there was that for a couple of years, but it was very warm and very welcoming. And I think Oregon still is. I mean, incredibly friendly and hospitable. I think we still have that as a community. But and just, you know, people taking the time to just chat with you, and people like, you know, when I was just a young intern or just the first year starting out, like, you know, stars in my eyes for some of these other, you know, winemakers that are out there that have been doing it here for 30 years. Just had started out, and so that was always something that appealed to me too. It was just like everyone was so humble, and I think there's still. I don't think that much has changed in that regard. We've seen a lot of outside interest come in, but I think at its core, Oregon's sort of wine community has stayed true to itself, and a lot of those people are still involved and still around. So I think it's just becoming a part of that.
Tell me about Pinot Noir. Obviously, it wasn't the first and only thing you'd worked with. So tell me about what was interesting and unique to learn about working with Pinot.
It's a lot harder to work with than certainly Bordeaux varietals. Not to say that they are easy by any means, but in comparison, it's slightly more of a set it and forget it. At least from what I've seen, and where Pinot Noir is, much more fickle when it comes to temperature and extraction and feeling like you're getting enough out of it. Certainly growing, although I'm reminded constantly by my brother in the Finger Lakes how easy we have it out here in terms of disease pressure. He's taking out a lot more for rot than I am and every year. But yeah, I mean, it's just the challenge of it, and now that I'm as far into it as I am, seeing how it does express where it's from, working at Adelsheim, all the sites they had at the time, and then, moving to Beaux Freres and having mostly just those few sites, but the expression of those few sites, and how distinct they all were from one another. And I think it's incredible for that. Like, it can just, can express the place. And it makes you work for it, but it's worth it.
So you mentioned Beaux Freres as the next stop. Before we get to Beaux Freres, tell me about sort of the progression of time for you at Adelsheim. You obviously mentioned cellar hand to cellar master pretty quickly. Tell me about the kind of your growth there and any kind of sort of milestones or memories along the way in that part of the process.
Yeah, I mean, it's all very much linked to, I suppose it would be, the harvests and the different. 2012 was, we had a terrible fruit set and low yields. 13 was the rain, so I remember, siphoning diesel out of a tank so we could refill the tank on the reefer because we had to keep the grapes cold because we had to get them all in before the rains. So I know what diesel tastes like now. Never needed to know that, but yeah, it's all an experience, right? And it's all memories. And I think the cellar master job at Adelsheim was more of a hybrid cellar master. I was very much involved in the winemaking process. I oversaw a lot of the white program. So when they're still making a lot of Pinot Gris at the time in Chardonnay, so about 14,000 cases I was responsible for during harvest with the two other interns. And that was fun. I think, it's a trial by fire. And you don't always know what you're getting for interns, although they were all wonderful, hard workers. They always did well for interns over there. But so in charge of the white program for a time, which was nice to have that and have that intensity during harvest and have that sort of able to carve that out as my own. And certainly learning from that, we did a lot of experimentation, but nothing too, not any kind of wild like orange wines or extended skin contact. That was a little too far outside of the range, but getting intimately connected with the fermentation process for white wines, so knowing the smells and the tastes and how it looks and when it seems like something might be going wrong, and there's some intuition there and not just numbers. I mean, you have to what is this smell going to turn into? What do these flavors develop into later on? And knowing within the style, the house style, when it's gone too far or when you need to intervene, something like that. So that was huge, and I took a lot from that, to the detriment of not being able to work with Pinot as much. But that was, Tracy and I, sort of a separation. She managed all the red fermentations, and I managed all the white pressing and fermentation. So it was a really easy division of labor there for the two of us. So there wasn't a lot of competition when we came home at night and passed out to do it again the next day. And that was, again, being allowed to have that space was awesome. I mean, my second year full time and being given that responsibility was huge. So the fact that Dave Page saw that and me and allowed me to have that responsibility I really appreciated that and took it very seriously.
So tell me about the next step. Tell me about going to Beaux Freres.
Yeah, well, everybody knows of Beaux Freres, but at the time it was sort of Willy Wonka's chocolate factory. Like the lights were always on, but no one ever saw anyone come or go. For me anyway. And then I randomly met Michael Etzel at the gym one morning. And we went to the same gym, and I introduced myself. And from that, I think we talked every morning, 5 days a week, a little bit for a year and a half. So got to know each other there. And then in there was a stop between Adelsheim and Beaux Freres. I worked for Drew Voigt for about 13 months, for about a year. And that was an interesting experience, and in that it was a completely different style, custom crush, clients, and so seeing that side of things. And I think personality-wise, it was just, I need to be focused. And so it was hard for me to feel like I was spreading my attention in all these different directions and feel like anything was being done well enough for my standards. I don't think anything, nothing went wrong, but it's just personality. And that was hard for me to have that sort of split. And so after about a year, Michael mentioned to me that Grant was moving on, Mikey was taking over, and I'd mentioned to him at the time that I was maybe also looking to move on. And so very serendipitously, they said, "You want to interview?" And yeah. And so we interviewed him and interviewed with Mikey, and got Drew in a good place, because this was August. So not great timing. So got as much done for him as I could in the time I had left. So, just, I think it was like 13 days straight, filter bottle, rack, and repeat. And again, but that's a hard time for anyone to move on. So that was difficult, but it was hard. I couldn't pass up the opportunity to work with Michael and with Beaux Freres Vineyard. And so it was September 6th I started, 2016, which was it was great, a great year. Mikey I'm not sure if you mentioned Pork Chop, his pet pig. She was about to have and did have her first litter. There's 4 or 5 piglets. And yeah, right in the middle of harvest. And vintage was great. I love the 2016s. Vintage was great, but it was sort of a whole new experience. And they're so good at it's just you've got the process, but it's wrapped up in personal, and it's hard to explain. It's such a special place, And it was all new to Mikey. It wasn't, because that's his home. But it was our first vintage together. My first time working with that fruit, and just not relearning, but learning very different processes.
So tell me about that. Tell me about getting to know the place and about getting to understand those processes.
Well, Mikey had just come off of working with, was he just at 00 before that? So we learned a lot from Ligier Belair, and that was a different way of making wine that I had seen before. I think it's not New World versus Old World, but it's a little more thoughtful in the process and the fermentation, monitoring temperatures a little more closely, and more for extraction than just sort of fermentation as a means to an end kind of thing. So much more nuanced. And then from Michael, who is still there, doling out nuggets of knowledge, still there, but the details and how important the details were, and really paying attention to that. Already somewhat of a detail-oriented person, but really like, having that point hammered home, and then having tasted and seen the final product enough at that point to know that there was certainly validity, and already realizing that, but that there's validity in that.
Give me an example of a detail or of a moment like that.
Keeping topping vessels topped, right? So they don't oxidize. We just check lids every day if there's anything in tank, checking bungs every day. It was just, it was everything. And checking all the valves, checking all the sample ports. But just the minutia and how important that was, how it all added up to a much better final product. Not that, it's different, not that it's better than the others, but I think all those things are part of the reason why Beaux Freres wines are so, much more sought after, much more elevated, however you want to say it, than some of the others. Is just that attention to detail, and that, they're hands-on, and they're like, it's very like self-reliant, and I think that was one thing that has appealed to me, is the self-reliance, doing it all yourself.
Was that obviously a different style of farming as well? I'm curious about getting to understand the vineyard there and the kind of the farming practices.
Yeah. So Mikey had been farming for 2 years, year and a half, again, when I showed up, and I, under seniors, I just call him senior, but Mike Etzel, senior's guidance, I took over the biodynamic program, and that became something that was huge for me. As a winemaker, being able to go in the growing season several times throughout the growing season and go, you're 3 miles an hour on a quad going through the vines and being able to see, and he was always very, adamant that you stay present, that you don't sort of daydream and go off and think, but stay present and make sure you watch and pay attention and focus on what you're doing. So having that mindset, or that was the guidance, like going through and just every vine, different parts of the vineyard, like how they're doing, what's happening there throughout the growing season. Is it behind? Is it ahead? Is it why? And then having that and remembering that, whether it's through notes or just having a decent memory still. How much longer I got for that, but and then having that, and then being able to take that into the winery during harvest. So how does it taste? How does it look? How's the fermentation doing? Is there a struggle? Can I correlate that to the vines, to that section of the vineyard? Is there a wet spot there? Certain times of the year, is it dry? So just paying attention, is it shaded by the trees? All those things that I think are important and certainly make a difference, especially in a wine that expresses a spot as much as Pinot Noir does. Because within that vineyard, you'd have, like, even the same clone, we had favorite spots on a 24-acre vineyard. And it was fairly consistent where they were. And others, we like certain years, and other years, they're just okay. Same with the upper terrace. So it's, even within these smaller, which again is why Pinot Noir is so exciting and interesting, is that you can have those things.
I'm curious about learning the biodynamic processes and I guess sort of giving yourself over to them as well. Tell me about that, about kind of learning not just the action, but also the meaning behind.
Yeah, Mike believed a little bit more in the, I'm sure it's spiritual side. Spiritual, celestial, but the less scientific side of it. I couldn't really, having listened to Rudolf Steiner's lectures, I couldn't make sense out of it. There's still a logical block in my head that I have for that. But I think the processes, whether it's sort of inoculating your vineyard with beneficial microbes in the soil, or spraying dandelion tea on the on the growing tips for silica. All those things I can sort of make sense of, and they work for me. I think they're important, very important, but also just again being present. Like that for me, that was the biggest part. Was just being present in the vineyard and having that intimacy with the vines, with that vineyard. I mean, I still miss that part of it, because you're just, 6 times a year, or more, just back and forth in the rows and just getting to know it all. And I think that's important. I think that's something that's, maybe it's not missing. Maybe plenty of people spend a lot of time in the vineyard, but for me, it's important to have that experience and to have that sort of base. And then I can, maybe there's not a connection, but at least I can see. I've seen it through the growing season, and if there's anything that's happening in the fermenter, in the barrel, in the final product, like just sort of put it all together. But I think for me, it's just being in the vineyard is huge. And it's something I didn't necessarily have an opportunity to do in my previous jobs. Just cellar master at Adelsheim was a big job and didn't allow for much time outdoors. And the Drew's clients were all over the valley, so, unless you want to spend a lot of time in a car, which I didn't have time for that either, but having that space at Beaux Freres to do that, and Mikey sort of took over the more conventional side of farming, sprays and stuff, and I did the biodynamic side of it. And again, very complimentary in that sense, in our working relationship there.
Tell me about 2020. Obviously, a challenging year in many ways. So I'm curious about your experiences both on the pandemic side and on the harvest side of that year.
Yeah. Trying to think. I had just gone back to New York to celebrate my dad's 70th birthday in March and came home. And that was I didn't travel again until I went to Nashville wine auction in 2022. So it was it was a strange time. Pandemic wise, I mean, that's putting it mildly, and I think I got off easy for the most part. At Beaux Freres, the tasting room was shut, so I was the only one with the controller into work every day because I'm the only one in the cellar, so I'm already distancing. I'm naturally socially distanced. But you can't just not show up, If a bung blows, you're oxidizing the wine, so just having to be there and again, be present for all of it. And that was nice. So I kept my routine, whereas a lot of people had this massive disruption. So my gym shut down. I couldn't go exercise, boo-hoo. But, I at least still had the routine of being able to go to work. And I think that was a big thing for me, and that, it made it less difficult or less disruptive. And then at the same time, Tracy and I were expecting our second child. So I think also when you're going through that, you naturally sort of tighten up the family unit as well. So we didn't go out and see a lot of people anyway. And she was born in March 2nd, 2021. So pregnant for most of that first year, and then yeah, she was born in 21. So it was planned. It wasn't a COVID baby, but it just happened to plan out that she became a COVID baby.
What about the harvest of 2020?
That was probably one of the most difficult harvests. Hands down, it was the most difficult. It was a lot of similarities to 2009 for me. 2009 was much more, I didn't have any skin in the game at that point. I was still an intern, and it sucked. I'd lost my job, but I didn't lose a vineyard, didn't lose a winery, or anything more tragic than that. But 2020, it's just tough because you've got a whole year of work that goes into growing these grapes. So there's that attachment, like I said, going through the vines, going through the vineyard and seeing it throughout the growing season, and having witnessed, because Australia had had smoke issues in 2007, so they were pouring us these wines and explaining that you don't fix this kind of thing. So having that in my head and then having to go through that process. And, first week of harvest, we lost power, right? So I sent one of our interns down to McMinnville, rented a job site, diesel generator. We had an electrician friend wired into the building. So we had a press full of white grapes, press full of Chardonnay. So he managed to wire it into the 3-phase, and we got the press up and running. We were able to get the press going. So we were fortunate enough that we still had power for that. We went through a lot of diesel, but we still had power at the winery for that first week. And that was lucky. But I found out later on that being outside during that time was the equivalent of smoking a pack and a half of cigarettes a day. I'm like, wow. I mean, the hardest part was it was a difficult harvest just because I knew that the wines just weren't going to be of the quality that we were used to, or that we were willing to accept. So it was just a lot of going through the motions, and that was hard. And then, being in the cellar, being alone in the cellar, and having that time to try to process it and try to work through it, but still knowing, and it's such an emotional, because one day you'll taste it, and then a week or two later, a month later, it's not there. It's it's that false hope that was hard. But in the back of my mind, knowing that no matter how hopeful I was, it was never going to be there. And yeah, it was a hard time to see people in the valley struggle with that. But again, I was in a lucky place in that we couldn't afford to miss a harvest, but we would be all right financially. And I don't know if everybody was in that. I know not everybody, few people were in that situation. So I think that was hard to see a lot of people have to go through.
So you mentioned earlier that you were starting at the same time that Mikey was starting his new role. So tell me about the 6-7 years together, growing into that. You mentioned sort of the complementary styles. Tell me about that, and about sort of by the end of your time at Beaux Freres, how the relationship had changed, or how you'd grown into that.
I mean, it was a natural separation of sort of labor, in that I took over the cellar, ran the bottling line, scheduled a lot of the materials and stuff. So I did essentially a lot of the winemaking work, and he did a lot of all the vineyard stuff. All the vineyard planning. At that point, somewhere in there they bought the Bridge Vineyard, and we're planting and planning, and he was doing the grafting project, which I was involved in earlier. But yeah, in my time at Beaux Freres, I think my first year was 2016, and it was 8,000 cases, 8,500 cases, and then 17 was a big year, naturally a big year. And that was a funny story. I'm not sure I should share, but a funny story. And it was Mikey's third or fourth year managing that vineyard, and we missed lag phase, so we didn't do lag weights, which is like how you estimate how much fruit you're going to have, and then you can drop or adjust accordingly. And we didn't do lag weights. We missed the lag phase, and senior went out, and he's like, "No, you're fine. It's holding 3 tons per acre. Don't worry about it." But then that year, all the clusters at the end of the season put on a lot of weight and became huge. So it came in, and it was significantly more everywhere than we thought it was. And so it's through the same number of 4 interns, and one of them was our marketing guy, Christopher Marshall, who'd never worked a harvest before, and me and Mikey and I and another fellow, Jeff Hagan, and it just kept coming, and it kept coming, and I think we had 2 or 3 20-hour days in a row, 21-hour days. I was still driving home to Dundee, so I'd drive home, take a shower, sleep for 2 hours, and then get up and go back to work. And that was brutal. I mean, that was pushing it to the limit, and not something I need to repeat, but we did it, and I can say I did it, and that's all I can say about it. But the wines turned out beautifully, just gorgeous. So you can't really complain about it. But anyway, I became the associate winemaker in 18. And, that was sort of a nod to the work that I was doing in the cellar, the quality that was, being carried through even at 10,000 cases. At 17, we're almost 13,000 cases. And still just me and the normal crew for bottling and stuff. And again, I enjoyed the challenge, and again, the double challenge of it's Beaux Freres, so it always has to be of a higher caliber. And maintaining that quality at that level, still just me. And yeah, it's a lot of pride. And there's a lot of pride in being able to do that. I'm sure there's plenty of other people, a lot of people doing it, but I took pride in that I was able to get it all done and to keep it going and not miss anything. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, we stayed at about that size, a little less, and until 2022. Mm-hmm. And yeah, I think it just got to a point where it just got to be too much. I took a lot of that onto my shoulders, a lot of the responsibility. Mikey did too in his own way, but it didn't leave me much sort of headspace or bandwidth for anything else. I think I started to have to pull back from the biodynamics just because it became too much. Mm-hmm. And then having kids during that time period, Mikey and I had our first the same year, which was fun. So our two oldest sons are the same age, and then he had a daughter and I had a daughter, and so it also changes your perspective on things. So your priorities kind of shift. So instead of being fine staying until 7 o'clock at night to spray a 500 spray, I just wanted to get home. So it all kind of worked out. And so by the end of it, he was stepping into his father's role, and his dad was sort of 100% Sackwater. And in the years before that, Mike was more and more involved with Sackwater. And that was fun, but he was sort of was the one who was sort of giving me the guiding principles there, and a lot of it I was taking from him, and the things that he would say, and sort of the advice he would give, and you got to watch the details, and I mean just incredible as far as like watching how he thought of the brand and how well he took care of that brand. I mean, it was sort of a fourth child, essentially. And yeah, it just felt like 7 years felt like a natural, mm-hmm. It was time. Mm-hmm. And in that time I'd met Drew and Aaron. And they were Drew's a club member at Beaux Freres, so we'd known each other for years. And someone asked me if I would be interested. And, 2008 I lived on the Boulder Bluff Vineyard, which is just next door here. So that house right up the hill. Always liked Boulder Bluff Vineyard. And he asked me if I'd like to come make wine for him. And I said, yeah, I'll take that trip. And, it's much smaller, so it gives me more time to go, sort of get back to the vineyard. There's more than just Pinot and Chardonnay, so I get to sort of flex my creative muscles and just, kind of play with some Viognier, some Syrah. And in that time, Tracy and I also did what we always said we wouldn't do, which was to make our own wine. So we've started our own 500 case, just under 500 case brand for ourselves, Folly of Man.
It's a fantastic name.
Thank you. It's still growing on her. I'm committed. I love it. Yeah. And also, we were fortunate enough to have a family member purchase a vineyard, and so now we have our own estate site, formerly Crawford Beck, now Folly of Man Estate, and that was August last year so it's almost been a year. If you had asked me a year and a half ago, would I still be at Beaux Freres, or I would have said yes. Mm-hmm. But things happen, things change, opportunities come up. It's a lot of having thought about this interview, there's a thread there where it's like, yeah, sure, I'll do that. it became, the decisions became much more thoughtful, but initially it was like, yeah, sure. But no, the decisions became much more thoughtful, choosing to come here, sort of back to where it all started, and knowing this little neighborhood, being familiar with it from my Adelsheim days, getting to work with Drew and Aaron, just incredible people, getting to sort of work with a new brand, and that's been fun, and thinking about how that works for them, for my own brand, and then now having a vineyard, so it's never a dull moment.
That's a lot.
Yeah.
That's a lot of changes. Okay. So obviously a lot of changes rapidly in the last couple of years. Let's talk about Compris first. Tell me about the change from not just site to site, but also world to world. Now you're the winemaker, you're the kind of head honcho decision maker. Tell me about how, if at all, that has sort of changed your outlook and about getting to know this new space versus the one you've been working at for so long.
Well, I mean, a winery is a winery, so there's not, that, for me, I think I've seen enough of them that they're not, and this one's very basic. It's not anything like they have at Lummelson or even Adelsheim, where it's sort of very specialized and set up to process fruit in a specific way. This is a little more open, a little more flowing. But having the freedom to make choices that I wanted to make. I think we all see things that we want to emulate and things that might not have worked out, and having been able to do that over there at Beaux Freres, and having seen that, and then having seen all the experiments that at Adelsheim, and the way that Drew made his wine at Harbor Voigt, and having all those little pieces and taking, there's always something to learn from any experience you have, whether it's something you want to do or something you don't want to do. And there were certainly those instances and all those experiences. And so now it's sort of taking that and putting it together in a cohesive manner, because it's, it's not just sort of like throw this, that, and the other thing at it. We're small enough here that the decisions have to be thoughtful. I like to have at least have an end goal, or have an idea of what the wine's going to be at the end, whether the vintage or the vineyard gives me that. It's nice to have a plan, but that plans don't always work out. So again, still being able to be nimble. But it's small enough here that there's not a lot of crazy experimentation. At least for now, it's just go with what I know works. Learn the site, learn what does and doesn't work at the site, and then start to grow and push out in different directions from there. Once I have those things figured out, and it's hopefully here for long enough that I can see it. I felt pretty good with the number of differences in vintages at Beaux Freres that learned that site well enough. But looking forward to having that here, and again, right back to where it all started.
How long does something like that take you, learning the site, and what are the benchmarks for you when it comes to learning a site like this?
I don't know if I could put an amount of time on it, because it depends what the vintages give you. Because there's always there's variation, certainly vintage to vintage. When you've got a vintage like 11, or you've got a vintage like 18, or even 22, and we had the frost. So we're sort of in uncharted territories right now. Weather-wise, so far this year's been a classic Oregon spring, like cool, a little bit of ups and downs, but extending into June. So that's nice to see that. We're a little farther behind than we are in years past, but it's more classic Oregon spring, which is nice to see, because we've had some weird weather for a few years now, whether it's the growing season or it's at harvest. We'll see what the season brings, but yeah, I couldn't put a time on how long it takes me. Certainly not an exact number of years. Winemakers, it's funny to get one shot a year, right? So don't screw it up. So it'll take me a while for sure. But knowing that the quality's there, the site's going to give me quality. I'm not going to have to worry about it. Knowing it's a warmer site, a lot of it's on RG, so RG tends to push fruit, that fruitiness, both aromatically and on the profile. So trying to build in a little more complexity there, whether it's the tannins, so all these little it's not tricks necessarily, but all these different sort of tools you pick up over the years. You get all these little bits, and eventually you have a toolbox you can use. And from experience, you know what will and won't work in certain circumstances. So it's nice to have somewhat of an idea of the site. It will take me time to get to know it intimately, you know. But already with Drew, I feel like we're in a good place.
Tell me about Harvest 2023 and what you're expecting Harvest 2024.
I think 23 was a great year. It was certainly a fun year, and it was on my own. It was a different year in that I wasn't sort of stuck at Beaux Freres for 6 weeks. I missed the crew, I missed the chef, and everything else, and having interns. But I'm a big fan of self-reliance, and again, that's something that appealed to me at Beaux Freres. So it's just me. I know doing the work, I know it's done right. If something's not done right, it's on me. So having accountability to myself, and you know, having Drew and Aaron again be able to jump in, because this sort of split this year for Harvest, having Folly of Man made at Longlow. So you know, work here, go over there, process fruit, come back here, do the pump overs. So a lot of driving time, but being able to make those decisions based on the rootstock, based on the clones, based on what I know about the site so far, feeling like I made a lot of the right decisions, and it's just sort of moving forward, minor tweaks that I have to make. But like the idea is always forward, always better every year, always trying to progress, whether that's professionally, personally, just learning. You know, I think that's one of the things that I ran into at Beaux Freres. I felt like I wasn't growing or learning anymore. I'd sort of come to the end of that in my time there. So this is starting it up all over again, and being able to try the things that I thought would work and might not work as well as I thought they would. But we learned, and you know, and next year's another year.
So you mentioned that you and Tracy always said you wouldn't start your own label, and then you went and did it. So what caused you to finally do it?
I mean, we didn't want to do it because we have hobbies and enjoy our free time and time away from work, you know. And we still like each other, so that helps. And we like our children very much, so that also helps. So that's, you know, and Adelsheim was nice in that we were involved in some of the other aspects of it, so we got to see the sales side of it, or we got to understand the sales side of it, and saw that, and I think quickly realized that if you make your wine during the week, then you spend your weekends trying to sell your wine, and we just didn't want to give up that time. But we got to a point where, you know, everybody asks you, and you know, if you're a winemaker, when are you going to make your own? And I was convinced I'd rather make it for someone else and just be able to. I mean, you can never leave it at the door, but, you know, kind of give myself the time. And I think we finally just, together, but not talking about it, why don't we just make our own wine, you know? It just seems like it makes sense. And at that time, she was transitioning out of Nicholas J. And I had left Beaux Freres, so it was June last year, or I guess now May, when we decided we're going to do it. So it's late in the game already. All the fruit contracts had been signed in January, and yeah, we said we're going to keep it small, so we're just 500 cases, just because we still don't want it to be sales to be a full-time job. We still enjoy our time away from it, and want to keep that. Came together and decided, like, why don't we just make our own wine? It would be great. Like, how could it not be? Like, I don't know, it might not be, but we don't know yet. It's still in barrel, so there's plenty of time for things to go sideways. But no, it's been fun. It's been a fun process. We worked very well together at Adelsheim and enjoyed working together at Adelsheim. A lot of people are wondering how do you work all day and then go home and what do you talk about? I'm like, well, I'm not a big talker, so we don't. But yeah, it was just it's sort of a natural progression, I think, not only for our careers and who we are, but also where we started. You know, sort of, again, coming full circle. That seems to be the new theme. It's just right back. And that's been fun because she learned a very different style of making, also very European, French style of winemaking from Jean Nicolas, and Mikey took a lot from his experience at 00. So that's where I learned, and they're very similar, but with very different end results. Mm-hmm. So it's putting those two things together and not necessarily just like cramming them together and hoping they work, but, her ideas, my ideas, and sort of it's an amalgam of everything we've learned and know, and making the types of wines that we know Oregon can make, like this world-class Pinot Noir. Mm-hmm. And now we have our estate site, and that's exciting. And again, learning that too, that's going to be the exciting and terrifying part, because we're working with Jessica Cortell for farming, but I'm doing as much of the tractor work as I can and learning all the different spots in the vineyard. And we haven't done some biodynamic sprays, but we're going to continue that process as well on that site. We're doing the same thing here at Compris, so it's just going to be both vineyards. So
tell me about that site. Obviously, I've seen the site. I know Crawford Beck Vineyard.
Mm-hmm. I saw that you interviewed David and Jean. Yeah.
Tell me about I guess approaching it from the perspective of it being your estate vineyard. What did it look like? What did you want to do with it? And what are kind of the short and long term goals for it?
Well, we were hesitant to buy a vineyard initially for the same reason we were hesitant to start a brand. All the exact same reasons, as a matter of fact. So we're just, but I think having our own sort of slice, and I recently walked around the vineyard with another winemaker I respect very much, who owns his own vineyard, and I said it might not have been the best year to buy a vineyard. He said, when is the best time to buy a vineyard? But just having the opportunity, I think it's unique for people our age with our level of experience in production to have a estate site, to have a vineyard site, and have it just be ours. That's exciting, and that's kind of a cool place to be. But like short term, it's the Becks did such an incredible job taking care of that vineyard, and that was a big part of the appeal. And we had worked, as a matter of fact, with the fruit back in 2012, I believe, and 13 at Adelsheim. So I had worked with it a little bit back then, but through that lens, it didn't work. Through that style and that lens, the vineyard just didn't work for their program. But knowing that plenty of other people had worked with it, over the years, good winemakers, and there were several vineyard designates, and so it was taken care of. It was all the right, Pinot, Chardonnay, little Pinot Meunier, and Pinot Gris. So it had all the varietals we would want to work with, and certainly for our brand, we want to be more focused on Pinot and Chardonnay as the two varietals that we make. But it's the Van Duzer wins. Eola-Amity is one of the more exciting AVAs, in my opinion, as a winemaker. Certainly for Chardonnay, I know that's where a lot of the best stuff's coming from, and in Pinot Noir as well. It's not a classic Eola-Amity site in that it's a little cooler but low elevation, so it's very affected. You can go to the top of the vineyard and you can see the Van Duzer corridor, and then you can go a little further down and you can look the other direction and see Mount Hood. So it's sort of a low point in the Eola-Amity Hills, so that wind just kind of blows right through there over Amity Road, and seeing what that does to the fruit, cooling it down, extending the growing season, thickening the skins on the grapes from the wind, all those things. And then just, we've got one vintage and we didn't have any control of the farming, so we were lucky enough that the clients that were in there, out of the kindness of their hearts, sold us back a couple of tons of our fruit, which they didn't have to, so we really appreciate it. So, we've got 50 cases of Chardonnay for 23 and then 125, 5 barrels of Pinot. So that was, great to have. So this year, having control over the farming from start to finish, seeing that through, we're working with the same fruit. And again, a lot of it's learning the vineyard and not we're selling most of it. We're only taking a little bit of Pinot and a third of the Chard. So we're going to have to learn from someone else's sort of experiences and through their interpretation of that vineyard, which is cool. It's exciting. I mean, one day maybe we'll take it over, but I think the short-term plan is to keep the brand again small so that sales aren't a chore. They're still fun. And I still have time to do as much of the farming as I can. And again, looking at the vineyard like any other brand, and I think it has amazing potential. 30-year-old vines, all the right clones. They did a great job of keeping it up and sort of inheriting that, taking that and continuing it on and building that reputation through the wine that we make and that the clients in there make. And long term, I don't know if we'll ever get to a point where we're making all of it. I mean, it's about 16 acres under vine. So that would be maybe 3,000 cases. And that, at least not currently, that's as big as we would want to get. We've talked about putting a winery on the site down there. It's not all set up for it, but it's water and electric is there. And having our own winery and tasting room. I have opinions on tasting rooms, but it's nothing anybody wants to or needs to hear. No, I think tasting rooms are great. I think it seems like maybe it's just our current economic conditions that they're a bit more of a chore than they are a revenue sort of builder. And I think that's just the time we're in right now. But it's an interesting time, and certainly the history major kind of helps to try to keep, part of me wants to try to keep it all in perspective, is this, we're just in a cycle. And it's not a cycle we haven't seen, it's just a cycle I haven't lived through yet, and few people in Oregon have, maybe, or remember, and so to keep it all in context.
So, you mentioned something earlier in that, talking about sort of other people's interpretations of the vines at Crawford Beck, or of the grapes at Crawford Beck, as being kind of a learning tool for you. So tell me about, just to kind of wrap up the winemaking part of this, tell me about interpreting grapes, interpreting a site. You mentioned Beaux Freres, obviously, as a site that interprets really well. What is your role as interpreter of a site as a winemaker, and how has your opinion of that changed as you've gotten further into your career?
I think I've become, I want to fiddle with things less. Much more of not hands off, but sort of let it ride. And again, a lot of that is the experience I've had at the different places I've been, where you see something and one house style might be really clean. So if you start to see reduction or you start to see any microbial issues, and you nip it in the bud right away, and one place might be more of, let's just have faith that we did the right thing and let it ride and see where it goes. And I've seen more often than not, as a winemaker, you can get in your own way. You can sort of compromise the final quality of the wine by overreacting or reacting in the wrong way. Whereas some, not all problems, but certainly a couple things can kind of sort themselves out, in the long run. And that was something that Mike Etzel Sr. told me is, at a certain point you have to have faith that you've done the right things for these wines. It's not a blind faith. There's a lot of information and numbers you have sort of to get to that point, but you have to have faith that you've done the right thing for this wine from start to finish. And once it's in the bottle, it's out in the world, it is what it is, And that was a different way of sort of looking at it and thinking about it, and that really, really settled in, so I appreciated that.
Talk about the future a little bit then. Obviously, you got a lot of new things. So let's give me an idea of what you're sort of looking ahead to now. What do the next few years look like, and what are you most excited for?
I'm all of it, really. I mean, it's just been a lot, one thing after another. If anything, I'm always looking over my shoulders to make sure nothing's gonna, knock me over the head. But no, I'm looking forward to learning a vineyard, having an estate vineyard, learning that vineyard, having this vineyard. You know, it's nice that Folly of Man is very collaborative with Tracy and I, and Compris is very much mine. You know, and so having those two things, I can sort of, you know, can't get too crazy, like I said, but having the creativity that I can do over here and then over there, we collaborate and decide, like, depending on what the fruit looks like, is the vineyard, you know, I know, have you know, having that piece. So it's nice to have a winemaker partner to bounce ideas off of, and vice versa. So I'm just excited for all of it. I mean, we release our wines in 2025, so excited, terrified for that, but mostly excited. I assume if I wasn't terrified a little bit, there'd be something wrong with me. But yeah, I'm excited for all of it, really.
We asked earlier about your kind of initial impressions of Oregon and the industry here. So tell me a little bit about evolution you've seen in Oregon, and about, from your opinion, where it might be headed next.
I think I've seen, since I started coming here, just a steady sort of increase in quality, and that's been great to see. I mean, I think you could go out and there was a lot less consistency in quality. I mean, it was all good, but you know, there are a lot of good wines, few great wines, and now it's hard not to find a really good or great wine in the valley. I think we're learning as a community, and we have, you know, certainly a lot of outside, you know, interests coming in California or France, and you know, that helps to just add to the knowledge base. And whether they're winemakers coming and bringing in what they know, or their consultants bringing in what they know, and that sort of disseminating out in the community, you know, high tide floats all boats, and that seems to be the trend. You know, I think we see, you know, certainly 2008, 2009 in the recession. You know, when I started coming here, I'm like, wow, there's wineries everywhere. And then 10 and 11, I'm like, whoa, there's fewer wineries, you know. But I think that's less of a indication of quality and more just tough times, you know. But generally speaking, I think the quality in the valley is just going to continue to go up. And, you know, we've got our established AVIs, and we know where fruit grows very well. But we also have there's a lot of space out there, as you just mentioned with the project you were talking about. You know, McMinnville's AVA is huge, and there's not a lot out there. There's certainly more to push out into Yamhill, Carlton. I feel like we might have hit a point now where some of those projects are going to kind of level off. We were in a pretty big growth phase for a while. Times were really good pre-pandemic and even during the pandemic. And I think it's going to taper off. But if that tapers off and quality can continue to go up, then, you know.
All right. All the questions that I have for you. Anything I didn't ask that I should have, or anything you'd like to cover that we didn't already cover?
I can't think of anything. Yeah.
Excellent.
If you got anything else, though. You got anything else?
Well, thank you so much for taking the time, sharing with us, sharing this space with us, and congratulations on all the new things you have going on, and good luck.
Thank you.
I'll go ahead and let you off the hook.